Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura B. Flosstube. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. Today is the day. This is the video that we've been waiting for. It is the finish up, the wrap up, the final video of the Bloom's Quilt Sew Along. So what you can expect in this video, we're going to show you how I did some long arm quilting to get the design that I wanted. It was a custom quilting design. And then I am going to show you how I attached my sleeve and binding to finish up my quilt. At the very end, I'm even going to take you outside with me to show you how I hang my quilts on the deck to get some photos that you may have seen on social media. So we have lots of things in store, so we better get started. Let's start off with some long arm quilting.
Here I am at my brother's. He has a Bernina Q24 long arm quilting machine. It's actually a really amazing machine. I've used it many times. I still cannot thread it on my own. It's not difficult to thread, it's just that I don't have much experience with it, and he loves me, so he does that for me. Obviously the quilt, backing, batting, and top are loaded onto the machine. What you didn't see was I did run a basting stitch along that top edge before I started quilting. And I just decided with this quilt to do a all-over custom design. So I am, free-forming it or, freestyle in my quilting. I have this design that I've just kind of started doing on a lot of quilts that it's kind of an edge to edge, but it's a combination of some feathers and some swirls and some flowers and some echoed roses type looking flowers. So that's what I decided to do with the bloom quilt. With my applique quilts, it's just kind of dependent on, I guess, my mood that day. Sometimes I'll do kind of like an edge-to-edge design like this one, and other times I will use a pantograph. He has a table on the back of this machine that we can lay out a pantograph and then follow that with a laser light, so it sews on the quilt top as you follow the design on the pantograph. And then other times I'll do more of like a custom design with like an echoing of the shapes, or I'll try to actually do custom quilting where I do something specific in each block. And then the background, I typically do like a meander or a simple design to kind of quilt it down. But on the bloom quilt, I decided to do this edge-to-edge design. Like I said, it's like some swirls and curls and feathers and flowers and echoed flowers. And I really like the way it turned out, and you'll see more photos of the quilting up close at the end of this video. But I do have a few more segments where I'm quilting that you can kind of see the movement on the quilt top itself. So he was very kind enough to let me set up a tripod and just kind of record me quilting on his Bernina, and I love it. It's a lot of fun, and the more times that I've used it, the definitely more comfortable that I've gotten with it. And yeah, so that's kind of the quilting journey, I guess. I have a few more clips here where you'll see the quilting a little closer, and I will probably just speed up the video on those and throw in some background music, because there's not much more to say about this. I know everyone does long arm quilting a little differently, and I'm sure that I'm not following all the rules, but this works, and I have a lot of fun doing it, and I love being able to say that I've done the entire quilt myself, not only the piecing and the applique, but also the quilting, and then, as you'll see later in this video today, the finishing and binding. So yeah.
Now I finished that quilting a couple weeks ago and I had a great time doing it, and it really gave me the results that I wanted. Now obviously if you don't have access to a long arm quilting machine, you're going to be at the mercy of your own sewing machine or another quilter that you hopefully know well enough to trust them with your bloom quilt. So the next thing we're going to talk about is attaching a sleeve. Anytime that you want to hang a quilt, you're going to need some way to attach it to the wall, right? Well, I've put up a curtain rod in my living room on the wall. My husband loves me so much. And so I attach sleeves to the backs of my quilts. Now I know that my curtain rod has a brace in the middle. So I actually attach 2 shorter sleeves that leave a gap in the middle of my quilt on the back. That way I account for that brace that will need to be sticking out between those 2 sleeves on the back of my quilt. And that way it hangs really nice and smoothly on the wall. Now, if you don't have a curtain rod or you don't want to deal with that, there is another product on the market that I would love to show you. And I'll put a link in the description box below. They're basically wooden quilt hangers. And you can attach those onto your wall with command strips, believe it or not, and then hang your quilt from them. And now that will make your quilt hang basically flat against your wall. It is pretty cool. Let me show you on one of the quilts in my craft space how that's going to work. Follow me over here. Now up here above my head, you can see on the wall there are 2 wooden rectangular squares. So this is what I'm using to hang quilts in my craft space. And I do that because I change the walls a lot. So they are attached with command hooks, which makes it very easy to attach and remove. And the quilt hangs basically flat against the wall. It's super cool. Like I said, I'll put a link in the description box below. So if you don't want to deal with a sleeve, this is a great choice for you. I want to put a sleeve on my bloom quilt. So we're going to head right on back to the cutting table so I can show you how I'm going to cut my sleeve. All right, so off camera, what I did was I took the entire width of my quilt and divided it by 2, and then allowed myself 3 or 4 inches extra just for that space in the middle for the bracket that's on my curtain rod. So I know that I need 2 sleeves that are basically 28 inches long, and I'm going to give or take that just a little bit, and I'll probably make them 27 just to make sure I have enough space in the middle. So I have fabric left over from the border of the quilt, and when I cut my sleeves, I cut them at 6 inches. And that's just because I know like how big my rod is, how much of a seam allowance I need to adjust for, and just how much space I want. Plus, I also know if I want to put these in the quilt show with my local guild, that it will go over a piece of PVC pipe, not my thin little curtain rod. So I want to make sure my sleeves are big enough to hang from their display racks as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my 6-inch ruler and I'm going to lay it on my fabric. And let's see, actually, let's make sure this is going to be big enough. And this is, oh yeah, this is plenty big for what I'm doing. So I'm just going to make sure I have this a line on the fold of the fabric so I know I'm cutting straight. And I'm going to cut 2 6-inch strips and then cut them down to the width that I need. Now remember I told you that I need these to be about 28 inches. So I'm just going to line this up. I'm actually lining them up on the 3 mark. So I know to cut them at, what would that be? I need 28, 14, 17. So we're going to line that up. I'm going to cut them at the 18 mark, which will give me 15, 30 inches because I want to make sure I have enough to turn under each end of my sleeve. So I have a nice, really finished look. I think I need to replace my rotary blade in my rotary cutter, guys. All right, so here are my sleeves, and what I'll do is I'll take them over to the sewing machine and I will just simply turn in the ends on a double fold, stitch that down on both ends, and then I'll take it to my ironing board and fold them in half and give this seam a nice press. After I have them pressed, I'll pin them to the top back edge of my quilt. Now, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and also cut my binding. So I need to make sure I look up my dimensions of the quilt, get myself a little quilty math going, and know how many strips of binding I need to cut. My quilty math for the Bloom quilt has told me that my quilt is 61 by 73. Now I did measure it just to be sure, and it is pretty close to 61 by 73. So I'm going to need 7 40-inch strips to go around the whole perimeter of the quilt. But I'm using some wide back fabric that I have, which is 108. So I'm not going to need 7 strips. I'm only going to need 3.5, but I'm going to go ahead and cut 4 because that extra 2.5-inch strip will just go right into my 2.5-inch bin and be used for another project later on. So I have my fabric laying here on the cutting board, and I'm going to swing you down so you can see. I'm just going to cut 2.5-inch strips, 4 of them. Now remember, I'm cutting 4 strips to get the whole length of binding that I need because I'm using this 108 wide back. So I like to cut at the 5-inch mark. And then, whoops, I gotta move my board over. That long fabric, woof, okay. And then I'm gonna cut at the 2.5-inch mark. And that'll give me 2 strips. And I'm gonna go ahead and cut 2 more, just so I have plenty. I'm going to need 3 and a little bit. I love this floral. It's probably one of my favorite wide back florals that I've used on any of my quilts. And looks like I still have some more to go. All right, I'm going to take all of these over to the sewing machine along with the sleeves and the quilt, and we're going to get sewing. So as I said earlier, the first thing I'm going to do is sew the ends of my sleeves into like a nice little double fold, just so I have that part done. I've been doing lots of binding today, so I still have the joining presser foot on my machine. Now you might notice I did not backstitch there, but it's going to be enclosed in my binding, so I don't need to worry about backstitching on the ends of these. I have sewn the ends of my sleeves, I've pressed them in half, and I've also sewn the ends of my binding together. Now, this is what I do. This is how I do it. I've done this many times. I've made, I don't know, over 300 quilts at this point. This is what I do. This is how I finish them. It is not the only way. It probably isn't the most accurate and perfect way, but it is what I do, and it's how I make my quilts work, and I like it. So I'm going to share that with you, but keep that in mind. If you have a different process you follow and that works for you, then do that. If you're looking at it and go, oh girl, you should not be doing that and you should not be doing that, I appreciate your input, but just let you know this is what I do, and you're probably not going to change me, okay? So I have my sleeve on the top edge of the back of my quilt, and I am just going to go in just a little bit from the edge. I'm going to swing you down so you can see this better, but I'm going to start a little in from the one of the edges and start pinning it along the top of the back of my quilt. All right, so you can see that I'm probably about 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch in, and I'm just going to put a pin right here. I don't pin much on these, guys. I am sorry, I just don't. And I'll show you why in a little bit when I'm attaching the binding. But for right now, all you need to know is I put 3 or 4 pins in on the sleeve. And remember, this is only half of my sleeve because the other half is going to be on the other side of the quilt. And remember, I do have 2 of them because I have that brace in the middle of my curtain rod. And as you can tell, I purposefully made it not long enough to cover the entire back because that's where that brace for that curtain rod is going to be. And I'm only pinning these in place just to kind of hold it. It doesn't have to be perfectly attached because, you know, obviously we'll sew it on with the machine, but it's just to hold it in place while I take it to the machine so I can start attaching my binding. And if you have a different process for attaching binding, which I'm sure you will, you are either going to be amazed, shocked, or flabbergasted, or appalled by what I show you next. All right, I have my binding strip. It's a 2.5-inch strip, basically in a pile on the floor by my machine. Sorry about that, didn't mean to kick the tripod. Whoops. I am going to switch to my 1/4-inch foot. And I'm starting on the side of the quilt that will have me coming up the side and then turning across the top to catch that sleeve. All right, this is where we're gonna probably part ways, guys. I'm so sorry, but I do not pre-press my binding strips. I just don't. I used to all the time, and then I realized that it was really just a waste of my time. I can hold 2 edges together. I also don't pin. Don't pin my binding onto the quilt, and I don't pre-press them in half. I do try to make sure I don't roll over my binding strip though, because that really slows down the process. All right, I'm gonna leave about a 4 to 5-inch tail, and I'm just gonna start sewing. And I am sewing with my 1/4-inch foot, so I know that I am a 1/4 inch from the edge, and I leave it on the setting of the machine, which is 2.4 stitch length. I'm using a Juki DX7. So I would say, you know, whatever your standard stitch length is, that's what I do. And like I said, I fold these in half. I kind of give it a little hand press and start sewing along the side. There was a very, very nice lady at a quilt shop when I first started quilting that showed me how to put on binding. Now she did pre-press her binding strips, but we'll just ignore that fact. I changed it just a smidge. All right, now you want to be a 1/4 inch from your corner. So what I do is my finger's about a 1/4 inch wide. So I take this and I do a back stitch and I cut it. And now we're on that top edge of the quilt with your sleeve. Now remember, the sleeve, I did press it in half. And I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes I don't. But today I did. And now for this corner, my strip is going off like this. I'm basically going to take this at a 90-degree angle, so it goes just out like this, and then fold it back down. And then that's going to make my nice little mitered corner for my binding. Take a few stitches, do a little back stitch to secure that in place. Get the strip folded tight with my finger. Now remember, I have some pins here. I'm going to go ahead and take that little bird out. And I'm sewing through all the layers of the quilt at this point. I'm sewing through the layers of the quilt, the 2 layers of the sleeve, and the 2 layers of the binding. So all of that is with 1 stitch. Now, if you are not confident in doing that, you do not have to do that. There is nothing wrong with running your stitch for your sleeve. I would just go a little less than a 1/4 inch if you're going to do it separately, just because, now I'm also going to show you that sometimes I go ahead and go over the pen, because these pens from Riley Blake are very, very thin, and I have never ever had a problem, and I'm sure now that I've said that I will, but I have not had a problem with it in the past if I do sew over a pen, because they're so thin the needle just moves and it'll be fine. I do try to remove them though. But sometimes you need 3 hands and I only have 2. I just want to get to the corner so I can show you how that sleeve is attached inside that binding. And then I'm going to do the rest of the binding around on the back side of the quilt. And then I will catch up with you when we do the front side. I'm going to show you one more corner too, just because I feel like that's the trickiest part. And again, just as I did before, I'm going to put my finger here on the edge. So I know that's basically 1/4 of an inch. Turn this corner. Oops. All right, and again, the binding strip is coming out straight. I'm going to flip that up at a 90-degree angle so it is even with the side that I'm going to be sewing on. And then simply fold that down with the edge of the quilt there in the corner. And then I'm going to carry on down the side. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the other 2 sides of this quilt, and then we'll catch up on the front side. I'm on the last side of the quilt, attaching the binding to the back of the quilt. So I'm going to show you how I finish this up. And again, this is probably not the way that you have typically seen this done. It is the way that I do it most of the time. But if you have a different method, then obviously do your thing, you know. It's all good. But this works for me, and I will continue doing it. So I've cut this just a little longer than where I started. And I have just folded the raw edge back, and I'm going to fold this under and over the first piece of binding that I put on. Move that so the edges align. And I'm just going to stitch along that edge until I have reached the point where I started. All right, so the binding is attached to the back of the quilt, and now I'm going to flip it over and do the finishing on the front of the quilt with this binding edge. Now I am going to switch my feet, and I'm going to use this little joiner foot. It's got this little, whoops, it's got a little piece of metal in the middle. And this little piece of metal right here is going to run right along the edge of my binding on the front of the quilt. And it's going to give me a nice consistent stitch all the way around the sides of my quilt. Oh, this is one of the hardest parts of finishing a quilt, is just wrangling all this fabric around and through on your machine. I do have a little stand here sitting beside me to kind of take some of the weight off the machine and just distribute a little evenly. Now I'm going to adjust my needle. I'm going to move my needle over. On the middle on my machine is 3.5. I'm going to move it over to about 6 or 6.2. And you hopefully can see this little, oh, you really can't, but believe me, that little metal piece is right on the edge of this binding. Just going to get that started. Now, if you are not comfortable holding this as you go, you can definitely use binding clips or pins to fold this over and make sure that your binding is coming around consistently to the front of your quilt. Like I said, I do several things the non-traditional way. Now remember, this quilt was made out of a ton of scraps that I already had on hand. Very excited that my binding and my sleeve were also able to be out of those scraps. I don't believe I purchased the backing fabric. I just purchased a plain white backing fabric for this quilt. I actually needed it for another quilt that I'm making. So I just purchased a little bit more. I actually ended up getting a 25-yard bolt of white fabric, and I have lots of it left over, but you know, white fabric you can use on so many different projects. All right, now when we get to this corner, I'm going to flip up this bottom edge right now to me and stick my finger in there to pull that around to give myself a nice little mitered corner. And I do a little back stitch there. Now I'm going to wrangle the next side of this quilt around so it'll kind of fall and go easily into my lap to make this a little easier for this edge. Lots of finagling and wrangling and moving when you're working on the binding of a quilt. Now I have tons of friends that they would never dream of doing a machine binding on their quilts. They only do hand binding for sewing it down. So if you're doing that, you're going to sew it to the front, you're going to sew your binding to the front with the machine with that 1/4 inch seam, and then you're going to flip it around and sew it down by hand to the back. But if you're doing machine binding, you sew your strips to the back of the quilt and flip them around to the front. And that's why that little joiner foot and setting my needle at a certain position really comes in handy, because then it keeps my stitching line consistent all the way around my quilt. Now you go as slow or fast as you need to make sure you keep that consistent. And I'm not going to tell you that mine is perfect, because they're not, but it's perfect enough for me. And ultimately, that's who I make my quilts for. Even if I give them away, originally they were made for my enjoyment. We're almost to another corner. All right, I'm going to finish up attaching this binding to the front of the quilt, and then I'll show you what we have to do to finish up our sleeve. Well, friends, we've made it through attaching our binding and attaching the top part of our sleeve, but this bottom part of our sleeve also has to be attached to the back of the quilt. And I will have to say this is my least favorite thing, and it's because it requires a needle and thread. Yes. Hand sewing. It is not my favorite, but it's got to be done. There are other ways. I have a couple of friends that they will sew just a very straight line with invisible thread, and they tell me it works, but my quilting is so pretty on the front and I don't want a line across there. So that's not going to work for me. So I'm going to take the needle and thread and just do a whip stitch all the way along here. I'm going to swing you down so you can watch me all my agony and pain. I'm just going to start with my needle. I have a knotted double strand of needle over here. And I'm just going to take a little bite with my needle, not going through the front of my quilt, obviously, and coming right back out on that little bit of sleeve. And that's what I'm going to do all the way along here. I should have chosen a sharper needle. But sometimes I choose a sharp needle and then I stick my finger, and that's no fun. I just hand work besides cross stitch is just not my thing. I don't do hand piecing. I don't do hand binding. I don't do hand applique. I just don't do hand quilting work. And I definitely don't hand quilt. So this is as much as you're going to get from me, and I apologize for all the dinging. My computer's on, and I guess I have some emails coming in, so that's fun. But I'm just going to continue along here sewing my sleeves, obviously putting a knot and stopping and then starting again in the middle there where we have it, the separation of the two sleeves. And then once this is together and done, then we're going to take it outside and hang it up, and I'll even bring you along for that. But basically I am just whip stitching along to get this sleeve tied down to the back of my quilt. If you know me at all, you know that I do very few things by hand except cross stitch. I don't hand quilt, I don't hand applique, I definitely don't hand piece, and I very, very rarely hand stitch anything onto a quilt. I definitely don't do my hand binding either. I do all of that by machine. But this is the one thing that I prefer to do by hand. And it doesn't take that long, and I don't have to be like super pretty with it. I can hide most of my stitching in the back side of the quilt, and you don't really see it. So, you know, otherwise, if it was something that was going to be seen a lot, then I probably would figure out a way to do it by machine as well. All right, so I have the first sleeve done. Now I'll move on to the second sleeve. And then after we have these sleeves attached, I'm going to take you with me as we go outside to hang this quilt up and take some beautiful photos. I'm so excited to get this bloom quilt done. It's definitely been one that I have wanted to do. And I'm so glad so many of you joined me. It's been so fun watching all of your photos and the different Facebook groups that I belong to, and Instagram, and on YouTube. So that's been super fun, just seeing how many people are following along and doing the bloom quilt with me. I do have another video series going now that's for my own design. It's an ornament quilt that I used a projector to project the image onto the wall, and traced all the shapes that I need, and I'm in the process of getting those all sewn up. I'm doing an interfacing applique technique just like we did for this bloom quilt. So if you enjoyed the interfacing applique technique, I encourage you to check out my ornament quilt tutorial. And other than that, I also released another floss tube. I try to do floss tubes every other week. So if you are interested in cross stitch at all, well, and even my quilting, because I give my quilting updates in my floss tubes as well. So if you're interested in seeing what I'm doing, other quilts that I'm making at the same time as we're talking about whatever we're talking about, then check out my floss tube. Right now, I'm working on the Moda Blockheads 5 set 2 blocks. I'm following along with that for the most part. I'm also doing Lori Holt's Mercantile Sampler. So I have updates on both of those in my floss tubes happening. And like I said, the ornament quilt. I have one more quilt left to bind after last week's quilting adventure. I guess that was 2 weekends ago, actually. Whew, time flies when you're having fun, I guess. I'm going to have to end this thread and start a new one before it gets too small to actually be able to end it. And I do a double knot here. I'll do a knot and then I'll take a stitch if my thread's long enough. The last one, my thread wasn't long enough because I kind of waited too long. I'll do another knot, and then I'll take this and run it underneath and out and give that a little tug to kind of hide the tail inside the back of the quilt. Now we need another piece of thread. I really like Mettler Thread. There are definitely different threads on the market. This is a silk finish cotton, and that's what I use in my machine, and that's what I use for hand stitching this binding on as well. Oh, we're almost there. So I'm going to start this again. I do have a knot in the end of my thread, but sometimes just for a little added security, I'll make another one of those little loopy knots just to make sure. We don't want the sleeve coming off or quilt fall to the ground. We are getting there. And, you know, I probably take my stitches a little bigger than I should, but so far they've held up. I switch quilts out in my living room about once a month, or when I get around to it. Sometimes it's 6 or 7 weeks. Thankfully, all the quilts I have for the most part are my favorites. I actually recently sold a few of my quilts because I am getting quite the collection. I sold one applique quilt. I'm kind of partial to those because they take so much time, so I like hanging on to them. Although I do think that the Be Vintage is going to be up for grabs. I don't have anyone that needs a quilt that looks like that. And it's not one that I would hang in my living room. I did enjoy making it though. Sometimes you learn things from quilts that you're making that otherwise you wouldn't have. I really liked the border on that one. And it's definitely a border that I could use on other quilts in the future. Alright, so now we just need to make a couple knots, and then we will take it out to hang it and show it off. Alright gang, we're going to head outside and down the stairs. I already have the quilt hanging. I just wanted to show you kind of like where I hang my stuff to get a picture. So this is out the back side of my house, and forgive me for the shakiness here because I'm walking and talking, and well, there's a dog in my way. Hopefully I don't fall down because that would be embarrassing, right? Alright, so come down the steps. We just switch this around and you can see me. So here I have the quilt hanging off the deck, and I just use a couple of great big binder clips and attach it to the railing on my deck. Again, sorry for the shakiness. It's hard to walk smoothly. So it's just hanging off the back of the deck. And so I will be stepping back here and taking some photos to display on my social media accounts and to insert in the video.